and Zoom and live right here at Chabad House of Johannesburg, where we are delighted to have everyone. Thank you, Henry. It's so good to see everybody. Much appreciated. So let us recap just yesterday's discussion, and we'll get further and deeper into understanding this partnership, which we were talking about yesterday, how within the little bit of a DNA cell, there is the potential, the full potential for the growth and development of a fetus to become the human beings that each one of us Homo sapiens sitting or standing in this room have the potential to become. And that is obviously God could have found a way, other ways of doing it. And the same thing, we're using our analogy of the Torah. God could have found a way to communicate the entire Torah to us. But as we discussed, God wanted that the Torah should be a product of a partnership. Yeah, can you all see the screen? It's a collaboration of divine revelation and each of us applying our minds, our intellectual toil, our bodies. What did our ancestors say when God gave them the Torah? Last week's Parsha will be repeated again in this week's Parsha. Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will listen. So the first thing is the action that each of us does. It's about taking action, and that is most essential. It's the action. Each one of us plays our role. We all have our part of what we do and how we do it. And that is that's the first most fundamental part of our involvement. And this dynamic, you could call it, of the oral Torah and the written Torah, the textbook and the lecture, so to say, is God's way of incorporating us through our Torah learning that we get together here and study. So in the morning, you started off with some exercise, some physical activity, but it's not enough to take care of our bodies. We also need to take care of our minds and our souls. So this is what we do here. And that's an important and integral part of this entire process by which God expresses his wisdom and will to all of his creation, each and every single one of us, through the Torah, that we are partners with God. Now, the truth is that every part of Torah, we discussed this yesterday, both the written and the oral, is the product of divine human collaboration, because as we said yesterday, who gave us the Torah, right? Well, it's divine revelation, but through whom? Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe was a human being. So we see already there the fact that Moshe is the one who communicated it to us. And not only that, we discussed yesterday the varying levels of prophecy within the Torah, right? That within Torah itself, there are varying degrees of prophecy. So we see the divine revelation at Mount Sinai. We see God communicating to Moses. But then as we get to the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, is Moshe's own words. And as you go through the various prophets later on, the prophets themselves have varying degrees of prophecy. So again, you are seeing that even the written Torah is communicated through these varying degrees of human involvement. So even though we see it as immutable, it's God's divine revelation. But even within that revelation, there are levels of divine communication with humanity. Is someone able to tell the people who is it? Please. Now, on the other hand, even the most human components of the oral Torah are, at the end of the day, the divine wisdom, and will be and God's will. Shh, guys, please, if you have questions or comments, we always open the floor for that. But when people are shouting in the background, you should know it is distracting. And for those who are watching us online, it's very disturbing. Thank you. So even the spirituality of the Torah, right? The divine communication, it is being channeled through the medium of your mind. You're human as far as I understand, right? I know that I am, I think. Reminds me of artificial intelligence here. There was once a shul looking to hire a rabbi, and they asked the previous congregation about their former rabbi. And he said, they said he's the best. The chairman said, he's like Moses, King David, and an angel. After no time, they were very disappointed with him. And they go back to the previous chairman. They said, how could you lie to us? That I never lied. Like Moses, he can't speak properly. Like King David, he doesn't know English. And like an angel, he's not a mensch. Remember, God is communicating all this information to each of us. We use our human intelligence to process, to understand, and to implement that information. Not to get too mystical today, but you know that the word Chabad, you're all in Chabad house right now. Chabad is an acronym of Chachma, Bina, Das. Just wondering, where's Miriam today? She was here before. Oh, your funeral. Whose funeral? Oh no, that's very sad. Who? I'm very sorry to hear that. I saw her before. Well, you will all be missing out on the added commentary, whether you like it or not. Miriam's commentaries are always very valuable. I will say that. That's what I was looking for. But the Chachma, what is Chabad? It's an acronym of 3 words. It's a Chabad philosophy, right? Obviously, we know Chabad for all the work that Chabad does, and you could follow the Women's Convention that's concluding in New York right now. But Chabad is, as a philosophy, it's an acronym of 3 words: Chachma, Bina, Das. Wisdom, knowledge, understanding. Now, loosely translated, it seems just like 3 words, arbitrary way. What's wisdom, knowledge, understanding? But I want to just focus on the da'at, on the understanding. It's about implementation. Taking these ideas that we study and making them part of your life. It doesn't just remain intellectual ideas, wisdom. What's wisdom worth if it's not something that we implement? The Talmud has a debate. What's greater, study or action? Which one? Action. But guess what the Talmud concludes? It's the study. That's the point, exactly that point. Because without the study, you won't know what to do. So yes, the study is important because it leads to the action, which the action's the main thing. But without the study, you won't have the action. So of course, to study, we need to apply our minds. But applying our minds means being present. Because only then can we apply that which we're studying. Verstehst? Yeah? So, in the final analysis, my friends, every part of Torah, as we said, is a collaboration of divine revelation and human intellect. You need both. God gives us the Torah, God gives us the potential, God gives us our intellect, but it's up to us to make usage of it and to do something with it. Go back to the metaphor we said yesterday of the rabbi who was debating with a person who says, I'll accept the written law of the Torah, but not the oral. Because the written is the word of God, but the oral, that's man-made. And the rabbi said to him, and I'm just going to remind you that metaphor, although it's a few texts back, a few slides back. He said, remember the story about the king who gives the 2 advisors flax and wheat. One of them turned them into something that impressed the king. Right? He took the flax, made a beautiful tablecloth, a tapestry from it. The wheat, he turned it into cookies, biscuits, cakes, breads, bagels, whatever you like, goodies. The other one did nothing with it. So you're saying is you only want the divine wisdom, the written Torah. The written Torah is important. It's the foundation. But God wants the oral our application to it as well. And that's the partnership. In the written Torah, the divine revelation element is more dominant, right? That's the written Torah. Look, the divine revelation is more dominant. Okay? Our human involvement is secondary. All we need to do is to study it, is to apply our minds. Okay? But that's in contrast to the oral Torah. What happens in the oral Torah? The oral Torah, while it's the spark of wisdom, while it's the teachings that God gave Moses, the oral Torah continues to be developed today. Each one of us has that ability when we apply our mind. Now, of course, yes, essentially it's the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Midrash and Halach and all those. But when you apply your mind, and in today's day and age as well, we have modern inventions. How do you apply the Torah to modern inventions? That's the oral Torah. It's still being developed. So in that sense, God, so to speak, recedes to the background. God empowers us to use our minds to expound, to articulate his wisdom and will, which is what we do with the teachings in the oral Torah. Everything good? Questions? Okay, let's then ask the following question that I want to look at today. And this question is, why the words are significant? What's the importance? You know, there's a difference between the written and the oral dimensions of Torah, which is what? In the written Torah, it's not just the content, but every single word and letter is precise because it was divinely communicated and inspired by God, right? Divine. So every letter, every word, every dot, it's significant because that's the way God said it. And there's no extra words that come from Hashem. You know, when I speak, sometimes I add adjectives. I try to embellish my words. Maybe I think I sound more intelligent that way. Maybe you find me or more interesting that way. Maybe there's more for you to correct in what I'm saying, but I'm not God. If God says something, then it's specific. There's no redundancy. There's nothing superfluous. So if God says, if there's a repeated word, take today's Chumash as an example. Today's Torah portion, if you read it, today's Torah portion, we read about if one mistreats a stranger or a widow or orphan. What does God say? Let me open a Chumash for you, just quickly to remind you and to remind myself the words, because there's a little bit of repetition here, which seems a little bit out of place. Why do we have this repetition? So I'm opening today's Chumash. Luckily today I don't have to get the book. I could just quickly pick it up on my app, right? And here it says as follows. You shall not oppress a widow or orphan. If you oppress them, beware, for if they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. My wrath will be kindled, and I will slay you with the sword, and your wives will be widows and your children orphans. God is saying, I hear the words, I hear the cry. I hear the cry of the orphan. What's unique? I mean, we shouldn't oppress anyone, not just a widow or orphan, right? Don't oppress anybody. But perhaps the message Rashi's telling us here is they're more vulnerable. They don't have a husband or father to help protect them. They're more vulnerable. Yes, it does. And it's repeated. And God says their cry will come out. I will hear their cry. So again, you see the specific wording in every letter, word, every single part of Torah. So in the written Torah, everything is exact. It's specific. It's the word of God. And therefore the exact wording is analyzed, and the laws and the insights that are derived are not just not just from what the verse says, but also from the exact phraseology, right? The exact wording. In fact, even the spelling. Take another example of today's parsha. We see In kesef talves ami, when you lend money to my people, generally the word im means if. Here Rashi tells us it means when. It's not optional to lend money to your fellow Jew when they are in need. Rashi says it's not optional. Here's im means when. So of course, every word in Torah, and we'll study some examples of this maybe in some of the coming lessons. But the point I'm making is no translation of Torah can ever really truly capture the full meaning of the original Hebrew text of the written Torah, because there's so many layers of meaning in every single word and letter. And we'll look at some examples of that in the coming weeks, please God. But the point I'm trying to demonstrate is that that's why it's called the written Torah. The wording itself is also Torah. When it comes to the oral Torah, we say God empowers us to use our mind to expound, to articulate His wisdom, His will, right? We can use our own, what would you call it? A little bit of our own creative license. That's why there's so many commentaries and different discussions, and sometimes it can even be contradictory because there's lessons that can be derived. But when it comes to the written Torah, we have a rule that the words that were given in writing, we're not allowed to be communicated. We're not allowed to be written. We're not allowed to be orally, right? I gave you that text last week. If you want, I'll quickly go back to that text. Okay, let me quickly go back to it to remind you. Let's see where it is. I put it up here. Where did it go? Here it is. The pen in the mouth. Is this it? Yeah, this is it. The Gemara tells us that the words that were given in writing, we're not allowed to communicate them orally. They were specific. The written Torah must always be taught from the text, as the words themselves contain so much more than what can be taught by just communicating them, in our own words. It's not oral. It is written, right? So remember this, that the written Torah is an unalterable text. Every individual letter is significant, and every single word is precise. There's nothing extra within it. It's all specific the way God said it. It's divinely taught, it's divinely inspired, and there's nothing in it that can be altered in any way, shape, or form, because that's the way God gave it to us, right? So that, we said, is about the written Torah. Let me keep this up here for a moment. And you all know that a Sefer Torah, right, in which the 5 books, a Sefer Torah just has the 5 books of Moses in it. It's handwritten on parchments, right, with a specific type of ink. It's kept in the Aron HaKodesh, in the Holy Ark. And that emphasizes the sacredness of the words themselves. We see this scroll every single time we come to shul. Monday, Thursday, Shabbos. We read it Shabbos morning, Shabbos mincha. Now, the other 19 books of Tanakh, you saw on the screen, we talked about it last week, 24 books of Tanakh. They were written in the same way, right? If you go to Great Park Shul, they actually have the scrolls there in the entrance. Anyone here been to Great Park? A scroll for each one. So it's less commonly seen, but hey, Purim is coming up in 3 weeks from today will be Purim. What do we read the Megillah from? In fact, that's what Megillah means, scroll. Megillah Esther, the scroll of Esther, right? So many shuls, and that's why I was mentioning Great Park, because they read the Haftarah from those scroll. I don't know if Great Park does it regularly, but they used to. That even the Haftarahs, the reading from the prophets and the scriptures, are done from a scroll. When I was in New York last week, I went to the Rebbe's Ohel, and there was a man, they were approached me just like that, spontaneously. I wasn't prepared. It was a little bit of a challenge. He had a TV camera, And he said he comes there every day and he recites Tehillim from a scroll. He has some custom, I don't know where he got it from, but he had a source for it, that they read the Tehillim from a scroll and it brings blessing, salvation to those who need. So he gave me a scroll of Tehillim and he opened his TV screen. He says, every day, 1 o'clock, he does a live reading of Tehillim at the Rebbe's Ohel. And he asked me if I would mind to read a few chapters of Tehillim that he told me. Now, let me tell you the problem with that. Inside a scroll, there's no nekudas, no vowels. So he caught me off guard. Luckily, the chapters of Tehillim he gave me to read were 90 to 100. I know those well. So probably the reason I know those well, A, because they're in davening. B, when I was a child, those were the chapters of Tehillim relating to the Rebbe's age that I, said them every day. So I knew those well. But if he gave me, I don't know, chapter 53, I don't even know which one that is offhand, I'd be in trouble. Or 119, it's a very long one. If I don't know it by heart, how could I read it from the scroll? Every Shabbos when I read from the Torah, and I'm no expert Balkara, it takes me a lot of time to prepare. I go over the Torah numerous times in order to make sure I get it correct. And I still make mistakes. Luckily, I tell people in my shul, please correct my mistakes if I make any, because the Torah reading, as we're discussing, has to be exact. The words are precise. And if there's a letter missing for some reason, there's a meaning behind it. There's a reason behind it. So many shuls, not as many as used to be, but actually read the Haftarah, the prophets and scriptures, also from the scrolls. Luckily, I get to read it from a book. But they're all written originally, handwritten, on parchment, with the specific rules as well. And I'm just pointing that out just so you understand that this is relevant to all the parts of the Torah. So what's the point that I'm trying to say? The difference between the written and the oral Torah. Let's just sum it up. That the written Torah, we're saying, since the wording of the written Torah is divinely communicated, or as in the case of the prophets and scriptures, they were divinely inspired. Even the fifth book of the Torah, Devarim, was not the word of God. It's Moses' words, right? Moses was repeating it. So now the question is, what about the last few chapters where it's describing his passing? Some of the commentaries say those were written by Joshua, not by Moses himself. Others say Moses actually wrote it with Ruach HaKodesh before he passed away. Okay, whichever one it is. What's more plausible is that Joshua wrote it, right? But when you study Torah, you realize it's not just what our mind understands. We accept Torah as a matter of faith. When it comes to faith, we could accept that it's possible that Moses also wrote it, divine inspiration. Either way, whether it's divinely communicated or divinely inspired, it is the written word of God, and therefore it requires this deep analysis to understand the underlying meanings in each and every single word and phrase. Right? And that's why it has to be taught from the text, because the words themselves contain so much more than what can be taught by just communicating them in the teacher's own words. Well, I, as the teacher here today, would like to tell you, but I can't just make up my own words. On the other hand, in the case of the oral Torah, although much of it has actually been written down, but it remains essentially an oral communication in which the content is more significant than the actual wording. You understand? It's not about the specific words. Now, there are times, of course, when a particular insight is gleaned from the meaning of a phrase that appears in the oral Torah, in the wording of the Talmud or the Mishnah or the Medrash. But this is not on the same scale or with the same authority as the manner in which the writing and the wording of the written Torah is expounded. The written Torah is what the others might call gospel, or what do they call it? Gospel? I don't know. That's more Christian terminology, phraseology, but I'm using it just to illustrate this point, that it's the written word of God. We can't change it. On the other hand, the oral Torah, that is the oral Torah, we have the ability, we have the license to expound on it. And that's why the written Torah has to be read from the original text. Something very interesting, the Rebbe notes that this difference between these two forms of Torah also has a legal implication in halacha, which is halacha as in the actual law. That before learning Torah, as I mentioned yesterday, we say a bracha, we thank God, we praise God. No saying HaTorah, who asher bracha banu mikol ha'amim, who chose us amongst all the nations. For what? What are we chosen for? You ever watched Fiddler on the Roof? Tevye says, can't God choose another nation sometimes for some other things? You have to understand what we're chosen for. We're chosen to fulfill the Torah. That's what we're chosen to. You know, it's a privilege that comes with responsibilities. And so when we get an aliyah or when we're studying Torah, we are reminding ourselves that no saying, it's constantly being given, right? So let me ask you a question. Can a person who just read the words without understanding the meaning, can they still say this blessing? If you're just saying the words of the Torah, you're just reading it like, we often do with Tehillim, just reading words, can you still say this blessing? Do you need to understand the meaning of the words in order to say the blessing on the Torah? We're debating it here. Harold says you need to understand the words. Sapara says no. Well, let's put the text on the screen and see what it says. With the written Torah, a person says the blessing on the Torah when they read it, even if they don't understand what they are saying. You understand that? With the oral Torah, however, you have to understand what you're saying. Right? Because oral Torah learning entails human understanding. You have to understand what you're saying there. Okay? This is a halachic matter. So in other words, with the written Torah, we fulfill the mitzvah of learning Torah by just saying the words. Ideally, you should understand it. But guess what? Sometimes we don't understand it. You still fulfill your mitzvah. When it comes to the oral Torah, the mitzvah is to understand the content. If you don't understand the content, you're not really fulfilling that purpose. An example, you read the words of Torah, you are already fulfilling a mitzvah. But when you're studying Talmud, there's no point of just reading it. You have to actually intellect. It's something you have to process. You have to understand what you're saying, what you're learning. What's the point otherwise? Megillah is part of the written Torah. Yeah, and you could read it without understanding it, and you're still doing a mitzvah. Mishnah, Talmud, Halacha. The point of Halacha, it's Jewish law, not just to read the laws. You should understand the law. You have to implement it. Now, of course, that's why you're studying it. You do say a bracha, but the bracha is not just to read it. The Torah, if you just read Torah, verses of Torah, 24 books of Torah, Tanakh, any part of it, you say a blessing, and even if you didn't understand what you read, you fulfilled the mitzvah. You didn't waste the blessing. If you say the blessing on the oral Torah, but you didn't understand what you read, you didn't fulfill that purpose for which you said the blessing. Well, no, you should say a bracha anytime you study Torah. If you study any part of Torah, you should say the bracha. You should say the same bracha that I said. We said it this morning. Say it when you get an aliyah. Asher b'chabana mikol ha'amim v'nasa lanu Torah. So that God chose us from all the nations and gave us His Torah. Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you, God. No saint at Torah gives us the Torah. It's an ongoing process that God gives us the Torah. It's not just an event that occurred 3,335 years ago at Mount Sinai, but it's something that's occurring still today. Yes, that's Mishnah. Yeah, the same bracha. Yes, but when you study Pirkei Avot, that's oral Torah. You should understand what you're saying. It shouldn't just be words. I remember I had a teacher. I bumped into him in New York last week. Whenever we had questions, and I just realizing he was much younger then, we were much younger, but to me it didn't satisfy me and it annoyed me. I was about to tell him last week, but we were having such a good conversation, I didn't want to bring it up. Whenever I asked him something that I didn't understand, if he didn't understand it either, you know what he would say to me? It's just words. He was a British teacher. It's just words. And I was like, okay, what's that supposed to mean? I'm asking you what it means. It's not just words. We have to understand what these words mean. So maybe what he was saying is, if it comes to the written Torah, you don't understand it. Okay, it's words, but it's not just words. It's God's words. But when it comes to the oral Torah, you really should understand what he's saying. Okay, let's just recap, and I'm happy to take any questions. We talked about a cell, a strand of DNA that encapsulates everything that a person will become. Yes, it started off as just a little bit of sperm mixing with an egg, simplifying a whole biological process. But the point is, yes, that person is new, novel, constantly growing and developing. And that's what 9 months of gestation is. And those 9 months of gestation require the special environment, the incubation in a mother's womb. And you could say the same thing about any cell that has a potential to grow, not just human, as Miriam pointed out yesterday. But the point I'm saying is, it's just an analogy that I'm using, that the entire Torah was communicated to God, by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. The human mind, each one of us, our intellect is the womb in which that Torah develops and is constantly growing and expanding. We constantly grow and learn. And what we're saying is, that's the duality, the collaboration of the divine and human. Because God desired that the Torah should embody this partnership between him and us. Of course, every partnership has bylaws and rules. So there are rules about how we interpret the Torah. But what we said was, in the written Torah, the divine side of the partnership is what dominates, right? That's the written Torah. That's the divine partnership. That's why the words are specific. The wording, the text, the phraseology, every single letter, even those little crowns on top of the letters, everything is specific. But in the oral Torah, it's the human contribution that's more pronounced. And that's why the emphasis is the understanding. Speak up, I can't hear you. Absolutely, it's holy, it's Torah, which, as we said, there's the written Torah, there's the oral Torah, they're both Torah. The written Torah is those parchments of the 24 books of Tanakh. I mean, to simplify it, you could put it into a 1,000-page book. I think the book I had the other day that I showed you guys was like 982 pages. Think about that. Even if it's full pages, you could do a page or 2 or 3 a day or more. You could probably finish all of Tanakh in a year if you put your mind to it. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. It's all canon. It's all part of the Torah. Yep, 100%. Absolutely. Okay, ladies and gents, we got about 25 to 30 minutes remaining in today's shiur. What I want to do is take all this information that we discussed and to look at it, the relationship between the written and the oral Torah. And please God, in the coming weeks, we'll be doing a lot more of that. I wanted to bring my map here today. Okay, I didn't do that. It's okay. But the point is that every aspect of Torah, we're going to move forward. Some people asked if I would spend a little bit more time on the books of Tanakh. Let's see, we have a chance. Maybe we'll do it later, because I feel like we're going to wind up getting caught in the detail, whereas this was meant to be more of a bird's eye view, an overview. let's see what we do. What the plan was to go into major books of Judaism, of Jewish literature, right? Books of halacha, Torah law, of Kabbalah, the mystical dimension of Torah, of philosophy, of ethics, and to really just get that bird's eye view, to get an understanding of what each of these areas, these genres of Jewish literature tells us. And you could just get a nice understanding of it, right? But the truth is, as we said, all these different genres of Torah are contained actually within Tanakh, within the 24 books, within what we call the Bible, right? The written Torah includes every genre of knowledge and every style of learning. You have the laws, you have the ethics, you have the history and biography, you have poetry and philosophy, you have cosmology and psychology, you have all the different genres are all in the Torah, okay? All the different fields of learning that are developed in the oral Torah originate in the written Torah. So using that analogy of the DNA, right? Just to take it a little bit further, that this idea, this dynamic, just like a DNA strand contains the coding of the full range of aspects and dimensions that make the human being, that make a person, the physiology, right? The body type, the coloring, the metabolism, the intelligence, the psychology, it's all there. Well, in that same way, the written Torah is the source code, so to say, all the different genres of the oral Torah that we study, that we learn, all the different aspects. So when you look in all those books of the oral Torah, the Midrash and the Mishnah and the Gemara, the Talmud, right? That all comprise the Talmud. The Halacha, the Musar is the ethics, the Hakira, the Jewish philosophy and Kabbalah and mysticism, all that is within the DNA cell, the source code of the written Torah. And our plan, our idea of what we wanted to achieve in this beta course is that we will go through these different genres and see and look at different parts of the written law, the oral law. Maybe we'll reverse engineer it. We'll open the oral and find all of its sources, how it's derived, how it's legislated, where it comes from in the written Torah. And we'll trace all the teachings back to its source. And that is part of the idea that we want to achieve, right? So when you're looking at a DNA strand, you have the potential, the written Torah, so to say. Within it is the potential for all the laws that are developed all the way to this very day, which is what the Tzomah Institute in Israel, as an example, does, looking at modern technology and seeing how it applies today through Jewish law. So ultimately, every aspect, the entire oral Torah is included in that divine revelation that we read about in last week's parsha at Mount Sinai, and God gave us the Torah. So every single part of it, every part, all the oral law, it all comes from that same source. That he was studying it. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how it was, whether it was on Mount Sinai the first time around or the second time around. What's that? Yes. So the first time was to receive the Torah. The second time was to get the forgiveness, and the third time to receive the second tablets and bring, and confirm the forgiveness, right? But there's a lot to cover, and there's probably a lot of areas that we won't cover. Lots of commentaries, and which we talk about oftentimes. We won't have a chance to cover all that. But the point I'm making is that it's all part of the Torah, and it's all the seed was planted then at Mount Sinai. The development is happening to this very day. That's the point. So when you look at even modern day biblical commentaries, they all include elements of all the different genres of Torah. All these different genres that we look at here, these themes of Jewish literature, the source code is the Torah itself. The difference is that all the different genres that take the biblical text as their starting point and work outward, right, and give us the laws, the morals, the ethics, the philosophical and mystical insights. The commentaries are concerned with understanding the meaning of the text itself. So there's different ways of working. Are you working from the text and expanding further? Or are you looking at modern day inventions and going backward? That's the same thing. Either you're taking the verse and expounding on it, which is what most biblical commentaries do, right? Or you go in the other direction. You look at the modern innovations and see its source in the Torah. Either way. So let us conclude today's discussion with a few more points. There's still a few examples I want to give you. I want to start with one from my wife's great-grandfather, a great rabbi known as the acronym of his name. His name was Rabbi Yeshaya Alevi Horowitz. He wrote a book called Shnei Luchot Habrit. So he is known by the acronym of this title, Shalah, is an acronym of the book he wrote, Shnei Luchot Habrit. And he describes the relationship between the divine revelation at Sinai and the humanly expounded teachings that we do in each generation to this day, right? And that's what we do. So let us look. Did I miss a text here? Hold on a second. What did I do? Here it is. Okay, so just calling this the many faces of the Torah. I meant to put this after, so I put it in the wrong place. My apologies. We'll go back to this text after. I put it in the wrong spot. Let's first read his text, what he says, and then I'll go back to the point I wanted to make. Okay. I think so, yeah. Did you go to his grave? Wow. Yeah, my wife is a descendant of his. Many people are. He was a very fascinating personality. Shared a lot of great inspirational and innovative teachings. Let's read it. It says, in the blessing we say before the Torah, which we're talking about, notice in that Torah that God gives us the Torah. In truth, God has already given us the Torah, right? God gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai. We read it in last week's parsha. But he says, God still gives us the Torah. It's perpetual. What does that mean? The matter requires some elaboration, he says. The Torah says these words God spoke to you, to your entire assembly at the mountain. And the verse tells us, we read last week's parsha, that the word of God, loy pasak, it did not cease, v'lo yasaf, right? It didn't, and it didn't continue. What does that mean? So he says, the Targum Onkelos says it did not stop. God's voice did not stop. For it is a powerful voice that endures forever. Now, what happened at Mount Sinai? There must have been some experience, God's voice did not stop, it reverberated around the world. But my wife's great-grandfather, or say my children's great-great-grandfather, what he's saying here, based on the commentaries of Rashi, it tells you here's Rashi's commentary, it did not anymore, that God's voice did not again speak so openly and publicly as he did at Sinai. That God's voice, yes, God spoke at Mount Sinai, never happened again. He tells us here, if we look at these two interpretations, the first interpretation from Onkelos, it didn't stop because God's powerful voice that endures forever. Interpretation number one. Interpretation number two is God never revealed himself again as he did at Mount Sinai. So let's continue. Therefore, he says there's a profound significance to these two interpretations, as they are simultaneously both true. What does that mean? The divine voice spoke the Torah at Sinai and did not anymore, as all subsequent laws and edicts instituted by the sages throughout the generations were not explicitly commanded by God at the time. At the same time, it did not cease, for everything was included in potential form. Did God tell us at Mount Sinai all the laws that are being derived and legislated today? Well, according to Rabbi Horowitz, he says the potential was given them. Within that voice was the potential for those laws to be expounded and derived to this very day as they're being done. It's only that for everything there's a time and a season, as King Solomon says. You know the word kol zaman va'et. There's a time and a place, a season for everything, and therefore the time and had not yet come for that potential to emerge in actuality. So it wasn't yet the time for that. You know, last week I got back from my trip, so I had to say a blessing called Hagoma. You familiar with that blessing? The blessing that we thank God after going through what is potentially a dangerous situation. Right? So consider, our sages say, traveling overseas is a potentially dangerous experience, and therefore you have to do the blessing Hagoma. So I said the bracha, but I remember once there was a guy, Chaim, who came into the shul, came up to the bima, and he said his bracha. When his friends asked him why he said the bracha, so he says the whole story about his miraculous salvation. He said yesterday he passed by the river and he saw his wife doing the laundry, and she dipped his blue shirt into a bucket of this sudsy water, and then she spread it on our washboard and she proceeded to beat it with all her might with a club. She says that very morning, Chaim says that very morning, I almost put on that shirt that my wife was beating up there. Just imagine, he says, for some inexplicable reason, I changed my mind and I put on this yellow shirt that I'm wearing in shul today. It's a miracle that my every bone in my broken, looking at the way my wife, what she was doing there. Why am I saying that? There's a time and a place for everything, right? The point that Rabbi Horowitz is saying here is that the potential was given at Mount Sinai, but the time for that to be developed is today, or whenever that insight is being innovated. So while the potential was given then, the time and the place for its innovation is later on. That's the point. Of course, it's a changing world. And that's the point he's telling us here, that in accordance with the nature and the abilities of each, the qualities of each generation. Look at his words. I think I skipped a couple of lines, but the point he's saying, the sages of each generation were then roused to actualize from that potential in accordance with the time and season. So the time and season is today, or whenever it was expounded. But the potential was given when? Then. Exactly. The sages, as he's putting it in his words, they did not invent anything from their own minds, God forbid. It was actualized. They're actualizing the divine intent that was given at Mount Sinai. That's what he's saying. So he's talking about the halachas, about the principles that are applied to the development of Torah. I think it's a very profound thought, but the point is that we still develop those ideas to this day. There's a lot more to talk about. Let's utilize the next 15 minutes just to look at a few examples of this, okay? So let's take an example in halacha. Familiar with halacha? I want to use an example from the laws of resting on Shabbos, okay? In general, in the oral Torah, halacha refers to those books, various authors that focus on the law aspects of the Torah. Okay, this week's parsha, as an example, Mishpatim, gives us laws. And in fact, the very first verse of this week's parsha is Ve'ela HaMishpatim Asher Tasim Lifneim. God says to Moses, these are the laws you should place before them. You should give it to the Jewish people like an open platter, that it's easy to choose from. What is the code of Jewish law called in Hebrew? Shulchan Aruch, a set table. The set table that you could see the laws and apply the laws and understand the laws. So think of simple laws. 10 Commandments. Honor your father and mother. Or don't steal. It's placed before us. The Torah has 613 laws, divine commandments, and these are all biblical mitzvahs. They're divine commandments. They are from the Torah itself, God's words. Okay? So the difference between the biblical mitzvahs and the rabbinical mitzvahs is that the rabbinical ones were instituted by the sages. The sages are not allowed to add to God's words in the Torah. That's why we call them rabbinical. Cannot call them biblical. If they were biblical, then that would be violating, transgressing a command not to add or subtract from the Torah. Rather, what did the sages add? Safeguards, rails, so to say, that you shouldn't fall. In order to help us to understand and to observe the laws of the Torah, the sages added these safeguards. As I gave you examples of muktzah in the past, and we'll look at another example here right now. Pardon? Siaga Torah, offense to the Torah. Very good. But in the written Torah, many of the mitzvahs are expressed in a few lines of text. Very concise, right? Sometimes just a few words. Whereas those few words can now be developed into volumes of halachic literature of the oral Torah that will discuss and codify many hundreds of details governing these laws. All, just a second, all derived from these few lines or words. So take the laws of Shabbos as an example, which I'm going to put up here right now, that the Torah just says, keep Shabbos holy, right? Zachar Hashem Shabbos l'kadsha. That's it, simple verse. Remember the Shabbos day to sanctify it. Sheishes yamim tamay v'asisa lachtecha. 6 days you should do all your work. Uvayom hashvi Shabbos l'Hashem Elokecha. The 7th day is Shabbos to God. The Torah doesn't tell us too much. Yes, at the beginning of the Torah it says God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. And here and there in the Torah we'll have a few mentions. But when the Torah says don't work, what constitutes work? That we should desist from it on Shabbos. Is carrying a heavy load up the stairs inside my house considered work? What about baking a cake? We did a whole course on this, if you recall. So today I have to just keep it simple. But halacha is the field of Torah that deals with these questions. And it examines the words of Torah that the Torah uses. The Torah uses the word, there's multiple words for work. There's malacha, there's avoda. So right, it looks at other occasions in which this word malacha is used, because that's what the Torah says. Sheishes yamim tavot, for 6 days you should work. Ve'asisa kol malachtecha, and do all your work. So since the Torah says 6 days you should labor and do all your work, it's using two words here. Well, let's understand what that means. Where else, in what other contexts in the Torah is this phraseology used? Yeah, and that's this week's parsha. So based on these and many specific pointers, the bylaws, then on how to derive and legislate laws, halacha, the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud, the Rishonim, the Acharonim, they were able to determine which actions constitute work on Shabbos. And as we know, you could carry a load of bricks, okay, not bricks, but you could carry chairs, which are heavy, and tables to set up for your Shabbos meal, and that's not work. But flicking a switch, which is much easier, is work. Why? But that's the sages who are deriving. They derive all the various laws. From the Torah, they give us the principles, derived from the Torah itself, Lamed Tes Malachas, 39 forms of labor, which we're going to start reading about next week. They all have to do with the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle. And that's what we're not allowed to do on Shabbos, because as you'll see in the Torah, it gives us the laws of the building the Mishkan, and then it tells us the laws of Shabbos. So our sages compared the two and said, this is what building the Mishkan did not supersede the observance of Shabbos. And in that way, we are able to learn what is allowed, what's not allowed on Shabbos. And this is something the sages do. So let's read it right here in the words of the Mechilta, one of the commentaries in the Torah. And it says, 6 days you should work, you should labor and do all your work, as in this verse. It says, asks the Mechilta, is it possible for a person to do all their work in 6 days? Rather, he explains the meaning of the verse is, rest on Shabbos as if all your work is done. Rest from even thinking about work. So that whole course we did, Oasis in Time, the laws of Shabbos a couple of years back, all those laws, and all the books in the Talmud and Mishnah and Halacha about the laws of Shabbos are derived from just a few verses in the Torah. I know that was very brief, but it's just giving you an example. Let me take another example. Chakira, philosophy. Here is one that I get challenged about often. The principle of free choice. Free choice, one of those big, hot, red button topics that are addressed in various philosophical and theological works, and something that is oftentimes I'm grilled about. This principle of free choice. But the core of this concept, this principle, and the whole discussion around it is actually written in the Torah. Now, while we talked about Pharaoh in the past weeks, there's an explicit verse in the Torah. So, did Pharaoh have free choice? The Torah tells us he had free choice. He had free choice about how he was going to treat his subjects, his people, and he chose to enslave us and to persecute us. You mentioned Rabbi Feinstein before. Rabbi Feinstein gave a very beautiful commentary on that. He says, God behaves in a way that's midah keneged midah, an action for an action. The way we treat others is the way God treats us. So he says, because Pharaoh took away the free choice from his subjects, from his people, turned them into slaves, that's why God took away his free choice. And that's why the verse says God hardened his heart. But here's another verse in Deuteronomy and Devarim. God says, I placed before you this day life and good, death and evil. You have free choice. It's your choice. God said, I give you good. I give you that. I give you death. I give you evil. Your choice. Life and death I've set before you. Blessing and curse. But God tells you what to choose. What does God say? Choose life. I'm begging you. I'm beseeching you. I'm imploring you. But as human beings, God gave us free choice. And the Rambam analyzes these verses and derives from them certain philosophical ideas that I just want to give you an example of. And he gives us here the basis of morality. Let's read Maimonides' words very briefly. Freedom of choice has been granted to every person, says Rambam. If a person wants to turn to the path of good and to be righteous, choice is theirs. And if a person wants to turn to the path of evil and be wicked, guess what? Sure, absolutely. That's what Rambam tells us. This truth is a fundamental principle and pillar of the Torah and its commandments as it's written. See, I've set you before this day. I've showed you the verse up here. Good and death and evil. Says Rambam, were God to decree that a person should be righteous or wicked, or if there were to exist something in the very essence of a person's nature that would compel them toward a particular path, a particular conviction, a particular character trait, or a particular deed, how would God command us through the prophets, do this and do not do this? What place would the entire Torah even have? And by what measure of justice would God punish the wicked and reward the righteous if God would predetermine your decisions? So what's the meaning of the Torah's concluding words when God says, choose life. Is this a command? Is it a prediction? Is it a promise? Is it an empowerment, an ability? Right? And if it's any of these, how does this affect the freedom of our choice? Do we have free choice? So Rambam tells us this is actually a major philosophical debate amongst many philosophers throughout history. And many Torah commentaries grapple with these and so many other philosophical questions. They're constantly looking back to the writings of the Torah, to the concepts that are expressed by or implied by the Torah's statements and narratives. And this is the way these discussions are analyzed and derived and debated. Absolute. Well, that's an instruction. That's a command. Well, God is telling you, choose life. That's the question. Is that an instruction? Is it a suggestion? It's not a suggestion to keep Shabbos. It's a command. Yeah, this is Bechira. This is choice. Keeping Shabbos is a commandment. The question is, what's ubacharta b'chaim? Is that a commandment? Choose life. Is that a commandment? Or is that is that a suggestion? Is that an advice? Is that is God imploring you to do it? Okay, so I'm not concluding with that, but that's the point. Let's use another one or two more examples before we conclude today's shiur. I have a few more examples here. Let's conclude with one, okay, because it's late and I don't want to do too many. We'll conclude with Kabbalah. It's just an example, mysticism. So you have a taste of all these ideas. We took halacha, law, we took philosophy, let's take some mysticism. I'm not going to go too deep into it, don't worry. Okay, the divine attributes. So here's a verse in Kohelet, in Chronicles, in Divrei Hayamim. And this verse says, L'cha Hashem, we say it in davening every day, L'cha Hashem, Hagedula, V'Hagevura, V'Hatiferes. Right? When we walk with the Torah from the ark, when the Chazan walks around the shul, everybody has a chance to kiss the Torah. We sing these words from the Torah itself. To you, Hashem, is greatness and power and beauty and victory and splendor, as all that is in heaven and on earth. To you, Hashem, Mamlacha is kingship. Okay, I'm not a great singer, I'm sorry. But the point I'm making is, since these are words from Chronicles, from Divrei Hayamim, the last of the 24 books of Tanakh, in the scriptures, right? On the surface, it seems like basic words of praising God, no? But if you go into Jewish mysticism, into Kabbalah, that Madonna is all fascinated with, the mystical dimension of Judaism, then what are we talking here? What does it mean, greatness and power and beauty? So Kabbalah says this is describing the 7 sephiros, the divine attributes that define God's relationship with his creation. And each of these attributes, every single one of us possesses as well, with which we can interact with each other and the world. So the concept of these sephiros, these divine attributes, is one of the major themes of Kabbalah. And please God, we'll do this, not now, but after Pesach. And the reason I want to do this after Pesach is because between Pesach and Shavuos, we do a count every day. What's that count called? Sfira ta'omer, the counting of the Omer. But you know what Sfira means besides for counting? It's the attributes. So what do I tell you every year when we get to the Sfira time? It's not just about counting the days, it's about making the days count. That's why every single day of the Omer counting, what do? We look at another one of these attributes, and each attribute within the other attribute, because it's 49 days, there are 7 attributes. So what do? 7 times 7. We mix each attribute with each other. That gives you a total of 49. And we look at how each attribute, we start off with chesed, kindness. And we look, first day is chesed of chesed. the ultimate kindness, loving, unlimited, infinite loving kindness. But the next day we temper that kindness. We go chesed of gevura. Chesed with discipline. There's a disciplined kindness and there's a kind discipline. They're two different things. So I'm going to leave that for after Pesach because then it will be most relevant and we'll talk about it. But the reason I'm just putting it out there today is just to give you an example and how deep it can get. This is just the bird's eye view today. The Sephiros are key not only to understanding how God interacts with us, but also unlocking the inner workings of our own souls. So what do we do during the 7 weeks of Sephira? We count from the Exodus to God's giving us the Torah at Mount Sinai. Just like our ancestors, when they left Egypt, they realized it's not just freedom from slavery, it's freedom to receive the Torah. And that freedom from, in order to, requires a preparation. Every day we refine another attribute within ourselves. And all of these secrets within the divine attributes are embedded in these 7 key words. Lecha, to you, God, is Gedula, Gevura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod. You see it all in this verse. And that's just another way of looking at a verse of Torah, which seemingly is just a praise of God, but is actually far, far deeper. And that's the point, is that when you look in the Torah, and you don't just see it as just words, as my teacher once said, but rather you see the depth in it, then we know that we're studying it. That's what Jewish mysticism does. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion. And please God, just to summarize everything we said today, the letters and the words of the Torah, that's the source code, as you saw these examples now, for the entire body of Jewish teachings, Jewish literature. And so every single genre, subject, teaching, law in the oral Torah and throughout all of Jewish teachings has its source in the written Torah. And we gave you 3 examples here today. Law, as you saw in the laws of Shabbos. From philosophy, as you saw God saying, I placed before you this free choice. Choose. And then we just gave this example of Jewish mysticism. Please God, tomorrow, ladies and gents, just as we spent yesterday and today talking about the relationship between the written Torah and the oral Torah, and I don't know which way to go. I'm going to give you the choice. Should we take the time? I feel like it's going to take too long to go into each book. That's why we got the video. I'll tell you what I want to do tomorrow. I want to delve into another genre. I want to move into something else, change the style. So tomorrow, let's start looking at the Medrash. What is the Medrash, right? Is it a set of books? Is it a methodology? Is it, what is it? Okay, so we'll take some time to look at the methods by which our sages are able to derive, to excavate the multiple layers of meaning that are contained within the words and between the lines of the Torah, and we'll explore the mysterious pathways of the Medrash and the various parables that it employs. And I think you'll all enjoy it. And I certainly, as I take the time to prepare these lessons for you, I certainly think that you'll all enjoy this learning. Ladies and gents, do not go home. There's lunch for you. And in 50 minutes, right here, again in this room, we have Dr. Adam Stern from London, who will come here and will give you a fascinating talk. Today's topic, I already forgot what it is. Give me a second. Today's topic, Adam Stern, what is he going to do? Quickly, today's topic is high blood pressure. What are the levels that mean blood pressure is high? Do they vary with age as you get older? Natural variability in the day? How to properly measure and monitor blood pressure? There are some tricks here that I'll teach you. I'm looking forward to this class. You know what I'm going to do? I didn't say that, but for those of you joining us here on Zoom, I'm happy to put it on Zoom as well. So we could try to go on to Zoom. So we'll talk about non-medication ways of helping blood pressure. Why does blood pressure need to be treated? So this is fascinating. And for those who can't make it today, let me just tell you what next week we'll talk about. Next Tuesday, 12:30, Dr. Stern will talk about sleep. What are the ways that sleep benefit us? Some really interesting stuff here. And it's an area that has been researched quite a bit. And what non-drug ways to help your insomnia. And I think this will be a fascinating series. So join us for our Tuesday medical series starting today. He's going to give you a 20-30-minute lecture, and then I'll take questions and give you answers. Oh, he'll be here till Pesach. So this series will go from now till Pesach. Okay. I think he designed it as about a 6-week or 8-week series. I'm not sure, but I think you'll all find it interesting. There are weeks that are not going to happen. For example, in 3 weeks' time is Purim. So we're not going to have a class on Purim. Purim, we'll have to hear the Megillah and get drunk. So it's, there are days that we're off of this. All right, ladies and gents, I will try to put it onto the Zoom. So if you want, you can come back at 1:30 right here on Zoom as well. We'll do it right here in this room, and everybody's welcome. Thank you. Shikaya. Thank you so much. Lunch is served. Be back here in 45 minutes for our medical.